The bid counter on my screen read 0 when the hammer fell. Not one other registered bidder had placed a single credit. Not the Cathari Merchant Guild, which had 4 representatives sitting in the waiting room when I arrived. Not the Vorlian Trade Collective, whose ambassador had personally requested early auction access. Not even the Scrap Syndicate, and those people would buy a crushed tin can if they thought they could sell the dust. They all walked out before the opening bid was called. Every single one of them. My name is Cal Warren. I fix ships for a living. I have fixed ships since I was 17 years old, when my uncle dragged me into his repair bay on Vega Station 9 and handed me a welding torch without asking if I wanted one. I have crawled through engine rooms that smelled like burning copper and cold grease. I have patched hull breaches with my bare hands in zero-pressure suits that were 2 sizes too big. I have argued with ship owners who swore their engines were fine, right up until the moment those engines stopped working. I know ships the way some people know languages, instinctively, without thinking. So when I saw the listing for salvage lot 774 in the weekly station auction bulletin, I did not see a disaster. I saw a project. The listing was short. It always is when no one wants to talk about something. It read, 1 derelict deep space vessel, class unregistered, origin unverified, condition unknown, located at coordinates Delta 97 in the Pale Drift sector. Auction opens at 400 credits. No reserve. 400 credits. For a ship. I had 462 credits in my account at the time. I know that because I had checked that morning while eating a cold protein bar and trying to figure out how I was going to pay the bay rental fee that was already 11 days overdue. I should tell you something about the Pale Drift sector, because it matters. The Pale Drift is what happens when a star dies quietly. No explosion. No drama. The star just cools over millions of years until it stops giving off light, and everything around it goes dark and cold with it. No stations out there. No traffic lanes. No reason for any ship to be sitting in the dark at the edge of a lightless system, unless something had gone very wrong, or something very deliberate had been done. I did not think about that too hard at the time. I registered for the auction on a Tuesday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, the waiting list had 43 names on it, including 3 major trading guilds, and 1 name I recognized from the news feeds as belonging to a Vorlian salvage magnate, worth more credits than the entire Vega Station economy. By Wednesday morning, the waiting list had 0 names on it. I called the auction office. The clerk who answered was a young Drellin, with 4 arms, and the look of someone who had been told not to discuss something, and was finding that very difficult. I asked why the list had emptied overnight. She said she was not able to share information about other registered parties. I asked if there was something wrong with the listing. She said all listings were verified before posting. I asked if the ship was dangerous. She paused. It was a very specific kind of pause, the kind that answers the question better than any words would. Then she said, all listings comply with station safety regulations. I said thank you, and hung up. Any reasonable person would have withdrawn their registration at that point. I thought about it for approximately 4 minutes, while drinking bad coffee and staring at my empty repair bay. Then I thought about the rental bill sitting on my console. Then I thought about the fact that even a gutted, non-functional deep space vessel, stripped down to raw components and sold for parts, was worth more than 400 credits if you knew what you were doing. I knew what I was doing. The auction was held in Bay 14 on the lower commercial deck of Vega Station 9. It was a Thursday. The auctioneer was a Drellin male, older than the clerk, with gray patches on his upper arms that meant he was well past middle age by Drellin standards. His name tag said Voren. I was the only person in the room. Voren looked at me when I walked in. He looked at the empty seats. He looked at his data tablet. He looked back at me with an expression that was not quite pity, but was close enough to make me uncomfortable. He ran through the auction requirements as required by station law. He described the item. He called for opening bids. I bid 400 credits. He waited the required 60 seconds. The hammer fell. He pushed the access codes across the table to me without a word. I reached for them, and as my fingers touched the small data chip, he put his hand on top of mine. 4-fingered. Very still. He said quietly, "Human, you do not know what you have purchased." I looked at him. I waited. He pulled his hand back. He picked up his tablet. He walked out of the bay. I sat there for a moment with the data chip in my hand, and the silence pressing in from all sides. Then I went to get my ship. The coordinates in the listing took me 14 hours to reach. My hauler, a second-hand cargo runner I called the Dutchman because she always leaned slightly to port, no matter what I did to the stabilizers, was not built for comfort. I spent most of the journey drinking bad coffee from a thermos and running calculations on what I might find and what it might be worth. I was not prepared for what filled my cockpit window when I dropped out of drift speed. She was enormous. I do not mean large. I mean enormous, in the way that makes your brain struggle to process what it is seeing. 1 kilometer long, at minimum, possibly more, dark against the darker background of a dead star that gave off no light at all, so I was seeing her entirely by my hauler's forward floods and the faint reflections from my own running lights. And she was beautiful. That was the part I did not expect. Salvage ships are not usually beautiful. They are usually beaten up and scarred, and patched in ways that tell the story of every rough landing and every bad decision the previous owner ever made. This ship looked like she had been designed by someone who cared deeply, not just about function, but about form. The hull curved in ways that did not match any design school I had ever studied. The lines were long and flowing, and somehow suggested speed, even while the ship sat completely still. But she was wrong. I knew it the moment the feeling settled into my chest. Not wrong in the way a broken ship is wrong. Wrong in a deeper way, like a word that looks correct but means something you do not expect. I locked on and started bringing her in. The docking clamps engaged without any resistance. That meant the external systems still had some power. That was a good sign, and also, as I would come to understand later, the only simple and uncomplicated good sign I would encounter for quite some time. I suited up, checked my oxygen levels, picked up my scanner and my tool bag, and crossed through the docking tube into the ship. The air on the other side was cold and stale and smelled like metal that had been sealed in a small space for a very long time. My suit's environmental system said the atmosphere was breathable. Barely. Enough oxygen to survive, not enough to be comfortable. I kept the helmet on. The entrance corridor was wide. Wider than it needed to be for a single person, even if that person was wearing a large environmental suit. The ceiling was tall. The lighting was completely dead, so I was working by my suit's lamp, which threw a sharp white circle ahead of me and left everything else in darkness. I walked forward and started scanning. The scanner results were the first real problem. The hull composition came back as unregistered, not as an error, not as a read failure. The scanner recognized that it was scanning something, processed the data, searched its entire database, and returned. No match found. I had never seen that result before. Every alloy used in modern ship construction, and most alloys used in construction going back 300 years of galactic spaceflight, was in the scanner database. Not because I had a special scanner, because that is how long the database had been accumulating. Whatever this ship was made of was not in 300 years of records. I kept moving. The crew quarters were 4 levels down from the main corridor. I found them by following the ship's internal layout, which was logical in a way that felt almost familiar, like a floor plan someone had drawn with human comfort in mind, which was strange, because humans were the youngest spacefaring species in the known galaxy. We had been on the galactic stage for less than 200 years. Nobody built ships with us in mind. The bunks in the crew quarters were sized for a being between 5.5 and 6.5 feet tall, walking upright on 2 legs, with a wingspan consistent with 2 arms extending from the shoulders. The door handles were at a height that was exactly right for a human hand. I stood in the middle of the crew quarters for a long time. Then I went to find the ship's log room. I found it on the 3rd level, behind a door that took me 4 minutes to open, because the locking mechanism used a type of magnetic seal I had not seen before. Inside was a room roughly the size of my entire repair bay back on Vega Station. The walls were lined with data crystal storage racks. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. Every single crystal was dark. I pulled one out and examined it. The exterior casing was intact. The crystal itself had not been physically broken, but something had happened to it from the inside. A controlled discharge. A deliberate wipe. Someone had systematically destroyed every data record on this ship, and they had done it in a hurry, because the job was messy. Some crystals were only partially wiped. A few had fragments I might be able to recover with the right equipment. That told me something important. Someone had been on this ship, in this room, erasing everything they could find, as fast as they could, and the fact that they had not done a clean job told me they had been frightened. I left the log room and kept moving. The cargo holds were on the lower levels. There were 6 of them, and 5 were empty, their massive doors standing open on darkness and cold air. The 6th was at the far end of the lowest deck, and the door was not open. The door had been sealed. Not locked, sealed. Someone had taken a welding torch, a ship-grade one by the width of the bead, and run it around the full perimeter of that door. They had sealed it from the outside. The work was rough, uneven in places. The kind of welding you do when you are not thinking about the quality of the job, only about finishing it as fast as possible. I stood in front of that door for a full minute. In my experience, when something has been sealed shut, there is a reason. Sometimes the reason is boring. Sometimes the reason is dangerous. I have opened sealed compartments that contained nothing but a bad smell. I have also opened sealed compartments that contained decompression hazards and, once, a very unhappy and very large creature that had gotten itself trapped during loading. The sensible approach was to leave the door sealed and take the rest of the ship back to Vega Station for a full assessment. I pressed my ear against the cold metal of the door. It is an old mechanic's habit. Before you open something, you listen. You can learn a lot from the sounds inside a sealed space. Pressure differentials create certain tones. Leaking fluids move in specific patterns. Electrical shorts have their own particular ticking rhythm. I listened. From somewhere on the other side of that door, slowly and faintly, something breathed. I stepped back. I stood there in the dark corridor of a ship that should not exist, at the edge of a dead star system that nothing had any reason to visit, 14 hours from the nearest station, with 400 credits worth of purchase sitting around me, and a sound coming from behind a welded door that changed every assumption I had made since I first saw that auction listing. I thought about Voron's hand on mine. You do not know what you have purchased. I thought about 43 names disappearing from a waiting list overnight. I thought about a galaxy full of species who knew something I did not, and who had all decided, independently and unanimously, that whatever was at these coordinates was something they wanted nothing to do with. Then I went back to the Dutchman and got my cutting torch. Because I am Cal Warren, and I fix things, and I needed to understand what I had bought. I cut that door open. It took 40 minutes. The welding was thick in places, and I had to work carefully to avoid damaging whatever was on the other side. The torch threw orange light across the corridor walls, and the smell of hot metal filled my suit's filters until the recycler started complaining. When the last section gave way, the door swung inward on its own weight. Cold air pushed past me, colder than the rest of the ship. Whatever was in this hold had been kept at a temperature well below the ambient, which meant active cooling systems, which meant this room had been running on its own power supply the whole time. I stepped inside. The hold was large, like all the others, but unlike the others, it was not empty. In the center of the room, mounted on a frame that rose from the floor and was connected to the ceiling by thick conduits I could not immediately identify, was a stasis pod. It was roughly human-sized. The outer casing was a material I had not seen before, somewhere between metal and glass, with a faint internal luminescence that was not quite any color I had a name for. The pod was cracked along the left side, not broken through, but cracked, and the crack had been there long enough that frost had formed along it in a delicate fern pattern. The figure inside was visible through the pod's front facing. I moved closer. It was shaped like a person. 2 legs, 2 arms, a head. The proportions were close to human but not quite. The limbs were slightly too long. The head was slightly too large. The face, what I could see of it through the frost on the casing, had features that were arranged in a familiar pattern, but with differences that my brain kept trying to smooth over. The way you smooth over a word you have misread until you look at it again and see what it actually says. It was wearing a suit, not an environmental suit like mine, something fitted and complex, with structures across the shoulders and chest that I could not interpret. It was alive. I could see that even before I checked the pod's readouts. There was a quality to the stillness of the figure inside that was different from the stillness of something that had stopped. It was the stillness of something that was continuing, very slowly, with great effort, across what I was beginning to suspect was an enormous amount of time. I looked at the pod's external display panel. The display was in a script I did not recognize, but some of the readout formats were close enough to standard that I could guess at meanings. What I guessed was life support at 4% efficiency, core temperature stable, primary power failing, estimated time to critical system failure, unknown. I put down my tool bag and opened it. I am a mechanic. This is what I do. I started working on the pod's power coupling first, because that is always where you start. You cannot fix anything else until you have stable power. The coupling was a type I had never seen, but a coupling is a coupling. It takes power from one place and delivers it to another. The principle does not change. It took me 2 hours, and the better part of my spare power cell supply, but I got the pod system stabilized. The luminescence inside the casing brightened slightly. The readouts shifted. The frost on the crack began to slowly melt at the edges. I sat back on my heels and looked at what I had done. Then the figure inside the pod opened its eyes. They were dark, very dark, and there were 4 of them. 2 where I expected eyes to be, and 2 more, positioned slightly above and to the outside, giving a field of view that would have covered nearly the entire room. All 4 eyes found me immediately. We looked at each other. The figure's mouth moved. Sound came through the cracked casing, distorted and thin, but present. My suit's translation system, which covered 67 galactic languages and was considered one of the better civilian units on the market, began working through the sound. What it produced was not clean. It was fragments. Pieces of words from multiple language families simultaneously, like someone speaking the root form of a sentence that had later branched into dozens of different tongues. It was the linguistic equivalent of finding the ancestor of 100 different words in a single sound. But some of it resolved. I will not pretend I understood everything in those first moments. What I understood was this. The figure recognized me. Not me specifically. Not Cal Warren, mechanic, Vega Station 9, permanently behind on bay rental. But me in the categorical sense. The species sense. It recognized what I was. And the expression on its face, when it recognized me, was not relief, though there was some of that. It was not fear, though there was some of that too. It was the expression of someone who has been waiting for something they were not sure would ever come, and is now looking at it, and finding that the reality of it is both exactly what they expected and completely different from anything they imagined. I have seen that expression on people's faces when they see Earth for the first time, if they have only ever seen pictures. That particular collision of recognition and surprise. The fragments coming through my translator were building into something more coherent as the figure continued to speak. It was as if my system was learning the language in real time, pulling threads from dozens of related tongues and weaving them into something it could work with. After several minutes, one phrase came through clear and complete. "You are the Maker's children," it said. "You are not supposed to exist yet." I looked at the 4 dark eyes looking at me. I thought about the ship that was sized for a human body. I thought about 43 species walking away from an auction without a word. I thought about a sealed door and a figure kept alive across what I was now beginning to understand might be an incomprehensible span of time. I reached into my tool bag and pulled out my secondary power cell. I plugged it into the pod's auxiliary port. The readouts improved further. "You can explain that later," I said. "Right now, I need to know if the stasis sequence will hurt you, if I begin bringing you up to full revival temperature." The figure looked at me for a long moment. Then, very slowly, it said, "No." I got back to work. I will tell you something about working, when everything around you is confusing and large and carries implications you are not ready to think about. Working is the best thing you can do. It gives your hands something certain to do, while your mind processes the uncertain things in the background, quietly, at a pace you can manage. I spent 3 more hours on that pod. The figure inside, who I had begun calling Gray in my head for reasons I could not entirely explain, shifted gradually from stillness to something more like sleep, and then to something more like waking. The 4 eyes opened and closed. The long fingers moved against the casing. The suit's internal systems, whatever they were doing, cycled through a sequence of faint sounds that I took to mean they were restarting. I worked, and I thought. The ship was sized for something human-shaped. It was made of materials no one had recorded. It had been parked at the edge of a dead system, with no explanation, and every sapient species in this region of the galaxy had taken one look at the auction listing and decided they wanted nothing to do with it. Gray, or whatever its name actually was, had been sealed in a cargo hold and left in stasis for a period of time I had not yet established. The data records had been wiped, the ship's registry was blank, and the thing that had survived inside it had looked at me and said, "You were not supposed to exist yet." I thought about that phrase for a long time. Not supposed to exist yet. Not you were not supposed to be here. Not you should not have found this ship. But you were not supposed to exist yet. As if my existence as a human being was something that was on a schedule, something that was expected to happen. But later, at some point while I was thinking about this, I registered that the breathing sounds from inside the pod had changed. They had become more regular, deeper, the sounds of something waking up properly, not just stirring. I stopped what I was doing and looked up. Gray was looking at me, all four eyes, clear and focused. And then, in a voice that had steadied into something almost clean through my translator, it spoke an entire sentence. It said, "This ship is called the first seeding vessel. You are standing in the oldest human-built spacecraft ever constructed, and I have been waiting here, in this hold, for 83,000 years, for one of you to come and find me." I sat down on the floor of the cargo hold. I am not ashamed to admit that sometimes, the floor is exactly where you need to be. I sat there, and I looked up at the faint, not quite color glow of the stasis pod, and I thought about 83,000 years, and I thought about the first seeding vessel, and I thought about what the word seeding meant when you attached it to a vessel with that name, and I thought about humans, and I thought about the word yet. Then I stood up, because I am Cal Warren, and there was still a lot of work to do. The revival process was complete by the end of my second shift. I know that because I had been marking time by my suit's internal clock, and it read 31 hours since I first docked. When Gray finally sat up inside the pod, and the front panel released with a sound like a long, slow exhale, the cold air of the hold moved around us. Gray was taller than I had expected, close to 7 feet, though the posture was not quite upright in the way a human stands. The long limbs moved carefully, testing each joint the way someone does after a long time sitting still, which was an understatement that I found almost funny. The suit it wore was intact, up close. The structures across the shoulders and chest resolved into something I recognized as data storage, communication arrays, and several other components I could not name. It was a working suit, not decorative. Every part of it had a purpose. Gray's face, fully visible now without the frost, was something I found myself working to process. The features were not wrong. Exactly. They were just not calibrated to anything I had grown up seeing. The eyes were large relative to the face. The mouth was wide. The nose was a subtle suggestion rather than a prominent structure. The skin was a color between gray and pale gold that shifted slightly depending on the light angle. Gray looked at me and said, "You stayed." I said, "Of course I stayed. I need to know what I bought." Something happened in Gray's expression that I could not read. Yet it would take me some time to learn the language of that face. But I thought, in that moment, it might have been something close to appreciation. Gray said, "Sit down, Cal Warren. I will tell you everything, and I must warn you, what I tell you will change the way you understand the history of every species currently alive in this galaxy." I said. I figured as much. Talk slowly, so the translator can keep up. Gray talked for 6 hours. I will give you the version that took me considerably longer than 6 hours to fully absorb. There was, before any current galactic civilization existed, a species that called themselves the Architects, not in any language currently spoken. That name is a translation, and an imperfect one. What they called themselves, in their own tongue, meant something closer to the ones who prepare, or perhaps the ones who plant. The distinction matters. The Architects had been spacefaring for over 2 million years by the time they became what Gray was describing. They had explored the galaxy. They had catalogued it. They had found it full of simple life, and largely empty of complex life, and they had asked themselves a question that defined the rest of their history. Why is the galaxy so quiet? They spent 100,000 years answering that question. The answer, when they found it, was not what they had hoped for. The galaxy was quiet because something made it quiet. There were things in the deep spaces between star systems, old things, that had been present since long before the architects themselves existed. Gray called them the harvesters, though that was another translation. What they were was difficult to describe. They were not biological in any sense that maps to anything I know. They were not machines exactly either. They were something that existed in the spaces between definitions. And what they did, what they had always done, was find civilizations that had reached a certain level of development, and stop them. Not destroy them, stop them. The distinction, Gray told me, was important and terrible. A harvested civilization was not eliminated, it was reduced, returned to a state before the threshold that had triggered the harvester's attention, stripped of the developments that had made it dangerous, left alive but quiet, left alive but contained. The architects had found the remnants of harvested civilizations across the galaxy, species that should have been great and were instead trapped in loops of simple survival, their most advanced capacities somehow absent from their biology, bred out or blocked or simply gone. The architects had been afraid. They had spent another 50,000 years trying to understand the harvesters, and in that time, they had noticed something. The harvesters came when a civilization crossed a certain developmental threshold. They came reliably, on a timescale that the architects eventually learned to predict, and they came with a specific trigger. The trigger was the absence of fear. Every harvested civilization the architects found had shared one trait in its pre-harvest state. It had evolved, as almost all complex life does, a biological response to overwhelming threat, a submission instinct. When faced with something massively more powerful, the individual organism would freeze, become still, reduce its threat profile, wait for the danger to pass. It was a survival adaptation. It worked, across hundreds of millions of years of evolution, because sometimes waiting is the correct response. The harvesters had learned to work with it. The submission response was what they triggered. A harvested species did not fight back. It could not. The instinct was too deep, too biological, too automatic. By the time the conscious mind understood what was happening, the body had already gone still. The architects, being extremely old and extremely careful, had built that same submission response into every civilization they had ever guided or influenced. Every species currently in the galactic community had it. The Cathari had it. The Vorlians had it. The Drellans had it. Every species at the auction had it. It was why they had all walked away. They had looked at the listing. They had felt something they could not name, something old and biological and irresistible, and they had walked away without fully understanding why. The harvesters had touched this ship once. Their presence was recorded in the metal and the cold of the place. Every species with the submission response built in could feel it, even at a distance, even filtered through an auction listing. They had all felt it, and they had all gone quiet. I asked Gray why I had not felt it. Gray said, "Because you were built last." I sat with that for a moment. Built last, Gray explained, meant this. The architects had spent a very long time developing a plan. If you cannot prevent the harvesters from coming, you create something they cannot stop. You create a species without the submission response. A species that is adaptable in ways no other complex life had achieved. A species that, when faced with something it cannot immediately overcome, does not go still, but instead starts looking for another way. They had tried many times. They had failed many times. The parameters were extraordinarily difficult to achieve. Too little aggression and the species destroyed itself. Too much, and it destroyed everything else. The creativity and irrationality had to be balanced precisely against the capacity for cooperation. The refusal to accept limits had to coexist with enough caution to survive long enough to matter. Humanity was trial 27. I said, "Is that supposed to make me feel better or worse?" Gray said, with something that my translator described as dry, but my instincts read as something warmer than that. The previous 26 were not this successful. I thought about a lot of things then. I thought about the fact that every alien species in the galaxy had known about this, or known enough of it to understand why they were afraid of us, while we had been walking around thinking we were just the new ones, the young ones, the species still finding its feet. I thought about the trade embargoes that kept human expansion limited. I thought about the technology accidents that had slowed our development in certain directions. I thought about the colony ships that had never arrived at their destinations, and the investigations that had never produced satisfying answers. I thought about every species in the galactic community looking at humans with a mixture of caution and subtle hostility that we had always read as cultural difference, as the awkwardness of the newcomer, as something we would grow out of eventually. It was not that. They were afraid of what we would become when we understood what we were. I looked at Gray and I said, "Who else knows this?" Gray said, "Everyone. And no one admits it." I picked up my data tablet. I connected it to the Dutchman's long-range communication array through the ship's still-functional interface, because the ship's own communication system was in a separate status that Gray had not yet explained to me, and I did not want to use it without understanding it. I opened a broadcast channel. Gray said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I am going to tell everyone what you told me." Gray said, "That is not wise. The galactic community will not receive this well. There will be political and diplomatic consequences that cannot be predicted." I said, "Probably, yeah." Gray said, "You should consider this carefully." I said, "I have considered it." Gray said, "For how long?" I said, "About 30 seconds." Gray made a sound that my translator could not categorize. It might have been an attempt at laughter. It might have been despair. It was possibly both. I hit transmit. I broadcast Gray's account on every available channel. I broadcast it in Standard Galactic Common, which my translation system managed a rough version of, and in the 3 most widely spoken human languages for redundancy. I broadcast it on the official diplomatic frequencies and the civilian frequencies and the commercial frequencies. I broadcast it on several frequencies that Gray had indicated the ship used, and that I did not fully understand, but that Gray had gone very still when they activated. I was 2 minutes into the broadcast when Gray grabbed my arm. The grip was stronger than I expected from a being that had been in stasis for 83,000 years. Gray's 4 eyes were wide in a way that changed their geometry significantly. Gray said, "What frequencies did you use?" I showed Gray the list. Gray was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that has a weight to it. Gray said, "Cal Warren." I said, "Yeah." Gray said, "I need to tell you something I did not tell you before, because I did not think it would become relevant this quickly." I said, "Okay." Gray said, "When I came to this ship, I came because something was following me. Not the harvesters in the broad sense, something specific, a vanguard signal, an advance probe that the harvesters send ahead of themselves when they detect a development they want to evaluate. I sealed myself in the hold because the probe had locked onto this vessel, and I needed to make it appear that the ship was empty, abandoned, dead." I said, "And it worked?" Gray said, "For 83,000 years, yes." I thought about the frequencies I had just broadcast on. I thought about Gray going very still when they activated. I said, "Are any of those frequencies the kind the harvesters use?" Gray said, "Yes. 3 of them." I said, "And I just broadcast on all of them." Gray said, "Yes." I sat down again. Then I stood up, because sitting down was not going to help. I said, "Show me the ship's weapons systems." Gray looked at me for a long moment, and then Gray smiled. It was a strange expression on that face, but it was unmistakably a smile. Gray said, "Come with me." The bridge of the first seeding vessel was on the top level of the ship, which I had not yet reached. It was a large room with a curved forward observation window that looked out at the dead star and the darkness around it, and, as we arrived on the bridge and Gray began waking up systems that had been sleeping for 83,000 years, at something else. Something far out in the darkness that was not a star. Something that was moving. I looked at the shape of it and felt nothing. No instinct to be still. No biological whisper telling me to reduce my threat profile and wait. Nothing. I felt curious. And I felt something that took me a moment to identify. I felt annoyed. I had bought this ship for 400 credits. I had spent 31 hours fixing it and talking to an ancient being who had told me things that were going to take years to fully process. I had not slept. I had not eaten anything but the last 2 protein bars from my bag. My bay rental was now 12 days overdue. and something was coming toward me in the dark, because I had been careless with my broadcast frequencies. I said, "Walk me through the weapons." Gray did. It took 4 hours. Some of it I understood. Some of it I am still working on understanding. The core concept was this. The first seeding vessel was not a colony ship. It was never a colony ship. The seeding in its name referred to humanity, but the vessel itself was a weapon, the most advanced weapon the architects had ever built, designed for one purpose, designed for the thing that was coming toward us through the dark. The architects had built it 83,000 years ago, and never used it, because they had been trying to find humanity first. They had needed the species without the submission response to be the one to use it. They had been afraid, being very old and very careful, that if they used it themselves, the submission response built into their own biology would interfere at a critical moment. They had run out of time. Gray had survived. The ship had survived. And now I was here. I said, "Is this thing difficult to operate?" Gray said, "It is extremely complex. The architect engineers spent 60 years designing the control interface." I said, "Okay, but is it difficult?" Gray said, "The learning curve was designed for architect engineers with decades of training." I said, "So yes, walk me through it anyway." It was not, as it turned out, as difficult as Gray expected. I think the architects, when they designed the control interface, had known at some level who they were designing it for. It was logical in a way that felt mechanical. It responded to direct input, the way a well-designed system responds, with clarity, and without unnecessary steps. There were things that made no sense to me, and I said so clearly each time, and Gray explained them, and I adjusted. I jury-rigged 2 of the power coupling systems using components from my tool bag and methods that made Gray visibly uncomfortable. Gray said several times that was not how the system was designed to function. I said, "Is it functioning?" Gray checked. Gray said, "Yes." I said, "Then it is fine." By the time the harvester vessel had closed to a range that Gray defined as engagement distance, I had a working understanding of the primary systems, an incomplete but sufficient understanding of the targeting interface, and a very clear understanding of the one system that everything else depended on, which Gray called the seed drive but which I was already thinking of as the point of the whole thing. The harvester vessel was enormous, larger than the first seeding vessel, darker. It had a geometry that my eyes could not hold easily, not because of the submission response, but because it was built on principles that did not include any concern for aesthetics, or for the comfort of those looking at it. It was a thing designed entirely by function, and its function was not something that made it pleasant to observe. Gray said, "It is scanning us." I said, "Let it scan." Gray said, "It will determine we are active." I said, "I know. That is fine." The harvester vessel's scan completed. There was a pause. Gray's readings showed some kind of signal transmission from the harvester, directed outward, which Gray said was a report to whatever larger structure it was part of. I said, "Is that the only one nearby?" Gray said, "For now. The report will bring others. In time." I said, "How much time?" Gray said, "Days. Perhaps weeks." I said, "Okay. Let us make sure there is something worth reporting." I activated the seed drive. I will not describe what happened to the harvester vessel in detail, because the detail is less important than the fact. The architects had spent 60 years designing a weapon for exactly this purpose. The weapon worked. It worked completely, and it worked immediately. And the harvester vessel, which had existed for longer than human civilization, and had crossed the galaxy without ever being challenged effectively, was not there anymore. The darkness around the dead star was empty. I sat in the captain's seat of the first seeding vessel, in the silence after, and looked at the empty space where the harvester had been. My hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, from adrenaline and tiredness, and the particular physical response that comes after something enormous has happened, and your body is catching up. Gray was standing beside me, very still, looking at the same empty space. I said, "They will send more." Gray said, "Yes." I said, "And we need to warn the galactic community, properly this time, not just a broadcast." Gray said, "They will not want to hear it. The submission response will make them resist everything you tell them." I said, "I know." but they need to hear it anyway. Gray said, "You realize this changes everything. Not just the political situation. Everything. The way every species understands its history. The way humanity understands itself." I said, "Yeah," Gray said, "and you are prepared for that." I thought about 400 credits. I thought about a bay rental, 12 days overdue. I thought about an auctioneer pressing his four-fingered hand over mine in a room full of empty seats. I thought about Trial 27. I said, "Prepared is probably not the word, but I am here, and the work needs doing, so." Gray looked at me with all four eyes. And the expression on that ancient face, which I was starting to learn to read, was not pity, and not awe, and not fear. It was something much simpler than any of those things. Gray said, "The architects would have been glad to know you." I picked up my tool bag. There were still 40 broken systems on this ship. There was a galaxy that needed to be told the truth. There were more harvester vessels coming. I said, "Let us get started. I am Cal Warren. I bought a derelict ship at an empty auction for 400 credits because I could not afford to walk away from a good deal. Inside it, I found the oldest secret in the galaxy, a being older than every human civilization combined, the truth about what humanity was built to be, and a weapon that the architects spent 60 years designing and never got to use. I used it. What comes next is not simple. It is not clean. Telling a galaxy full of species that they have been quietly throttled for their entire histories because they were afraid of us, that every caution they exercised was rooted in something biological they did not choose, that the youngest species in the known galaxy is actually the one that was built to outlast all of them. That is not a conversation that goes smoothly. There have been emergency sessions of the Galactic Council. There have been diplomatic incidents. There have been species that reacted with anger, and species that reacted with something that looked like relief, and species that reacted with a silence that is still ongoing, and that Gray tells me is the most dangerous response of all. There are more harvester vessels coming. The report that the first one sent before I removed it from the equation has drawn attention from something much larger and much further away. Gray is working on what that means. I am working on the ship. 40 broken systems have become 31. I am making progress. I still have not paid the bay rental. Vega Station 9 sent me a formal notice 7 weeks ago. I sent back a message explaining the general situation. The station manager, a man named Pete Garfield, who I have known for 11 years, and who is one of the most unflappable people I have ever met, read my message, and then called me on a direct channel, and was quiet for almost a full minute before he said, "Cal, are you serious?" I said, "Pete, I am as serious as I have ever been about anything." Another silence. He said, "I am going to need you to come and explain this in person." I said, "I will, as soon as I can. I have not been able to, yet. There is always more work. There is always more work. But I want to tell you something. Anyone listening to this, whoever you are, whatever species you are, wherever in the galaxy you are sitting right now processing this account, the architects built humanity for a purpose. I understand that sounds like it removes something, like it makes us less free, or less real, or like everything we have ever done was planned by someone else before we existed. I thought about that for a long time. I talked to Gray about it across many shifts and many cold cups of coffee. Here is what I think. The architects built us to not have the submission response. They built us to be adaptable and stubborn and creative and irrational in the specific ways that produce new solutions. But they did not build what we did with those traits. They did not build every decision and every mistake and everything we made and every place we went. They gave us a starting point, and we have been doing the rest ourselves for 200,000 years. They built us to not be stopped. They did not plan what we would become. They just trusted that we would become something worth the wait. I think that is enough. I am Cal Warren. I bought a ship that nobody else wanted. I found something inside it that changed everything, and I am not done yet.